Do you remember when we first started talking about the nervous system, which one I said, if we were going to talk about the chicken or the egg, which one we're going to talk about coming first? Sensory or motor? Sensory, because our motor response is usually, is a response to a sensory stimuli. Okay, so when we look at the sensory aspects of the spinal column, we're looking at fibers that are coming in from the periphery. So this is showing the dorsal root here, dorsal ramus rather, ventral ramus, spinal nerve, dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root, and carrying information into the spinal column. So we're going to spend a lot of, in a complete entire lecture on looking at sensory pathways. So right now I'm just kind of giving you an idea so when you see it again, we're hearing this multiple times. So let's say that when I touch this tabletop, I am exciting the Meissner's corpuscles, and if I push harder, the Pacinian corpuscles. I'm activating receptors that then activate my sensory neuron. And that sends an electrical signal. And that sensory neuron is going to come in through a ventral ramus, carry an electrical current. It's sensory, so is it going to go ventral or posterior? Sensory is
posterior.
Posterior. So it comes in here, and cell bodies form the dorsal root ganglion. Notice what type of a sensory neuron I drew. Multipolar or pseudo-unipolar? Pseudo-unipolar. We said those were primarily what our sensory neurons were, except for the bipolars in our eye and our nose. So sensory neurons in our peripheral nervous system are pseudo-unipolar neurons. And their cell bodies are what form this swelling right here, which is the dorsal root ganglion. All right, so if we go back to this diagram, this would be the dorsal root ganglion right here. Okay? So sensory neurons coming in the ventral ramus would have their cell bodies forming the dorsal root ganglion, not just located there. That's why it's a swelling. It's because the cell bodies are so large. Is this going to be gray matter then, the dorsal root ganglion? Are cell bodies myelinated? No. So this is a gray matter structure. These cell bodies come into the posterior gray horn and synapse with cell bodies of additional neurons. That's why the posterior gray horn is gray, because it's formed of these cell bodies that are not myelinated. All right? Just for interest's sake, again, you just need to know the names of these structures. We're going to look at these particular pathways at the end of next week. But this is the pathway I'm drawing for you is the pathway for pain and temperature and crude touch. Okay, we're going to look at this in great detail next week, so don't feel like you have to know this right now. I'm just showing you some different pathways. This neuron, forming the gray matter, is going to send its fiber through the anterior white commissure and up the spinal cord towards the brain. Ascending. This is a sensory tract in the lateral white column. So we bring in, say, some sensory fibers from the foot. It's going to be a different ventral ramus, but I only have one on here. All right. And this entire area is formed of sensory fibers coming up from the entire spinal cord, all collecting together and carrying sensory information to the brain to be processed for pain, touch, crude touch, and temperature. That's why this is white, because it's myelinated fibers. Okay? Now, from the opposite side of the body, I have sensory neurons coming in and synapsing and doing the same thing on the opposite side. So just because I don't want you thinking this is only on one side of the body. So both the left and the right side of the spinal cord are going to have these tracts. In fact, For some individuals with chronic pain, that they can't function, they can't do anything because all they can deal with is the pain, there are surgical procedures, used to be with a knife, now it's going to be done with laser, where they go in and they just cut this area of the lateral right spinal cord. It's in the central nervous system so that it doesn't grow back. And all sensory input for pain, crude touch, and temperature from below that area is never going to get processed by the brain. So they might be numb on the lower half of their body. But that's preferable. At least they can deal with that and function. Okay, so it's a big step to do that. Sometimes they'll just put an electrical wire into the spinal cord, and the patient has a button that they can push, and it will kind of override all those impulses. So there's a variety of activities to deal with chronic pain of that nature. Now another, if I touch this table, all right, and I move over, now I'm touching the cardboard box, I can tell the difference between the surface and temperature, but specifically I can tell that I'm touching metal versus paper. All right, that discriminative touch, as well as knowing whether my fingers are flexed or extended, that joint sense and discriminative touch is carried by a different region. Again, this is for free. We're going to talk about those particular pathways. The cell bodies are always in the dorsal root ganglia. So no matter what sensory input is coming into your spinal cord, if it's below your face, it's going to be carried on a sensory neuron that forms the dorsal root ganglia. This particular neuron, instead of crossing, is going to go into the posterior white column. So all of the posterior white column is ascending fibers for that joint sense. Same with this side. Just to illustrate, there's a well-known neurologist who was called in to consult on a patient who had gone into the hospital to have a hysterectomy to remove the uterus. This was back in the time when you could go in the night before instead of having to show up at 4 o'clock in the morning. The insurance didn't want to pay for a night that you just slept. And she woke up and hit her panic button and called the nurse, and the nurse came in and she said, "I don't know where my arm is." And the nurse said, "Well, I can see both of your arms right there." She said, "Yeah, but I can't feel them." And they thought she was just having a hysterical attack because of the loss of her femaleness, because of the uterus removal and stuff. And so they delayed the surgery, and it progressively got worse. And it wasn't just her arm, it was her other arm and her lower limbs. And they finally called the neurologist in, and he examined her, and they did some blood studies. And she had gotten a viral infection, I don't know how, that destroyed all of these nerve fibers in her posterior white column. All sensory. She had no joint sense. So when she closed her eyes, she had no idea whether her fingers were closed or open. When she walked, she had to look at her lower extremities to know whether her hips were flexed or her knees were extended. And she never recovered. It was central nervous system damage. And she said the only time she could walk, she learned to walk, but she had to watch what she was doing, and she looked, drunk and unsteady, which she was, unsteady at least. She said the only time she felt alive was in a convertible, where the pressure of the air flowing against her body gave her a sense of where her body parts were, because she still had the pressure sensation. Okay, so posterior white column is completely sensory. On your list, put an S by posterior white column. Yes, Susan. That we're going to talk about that in our second lecture today. Okay, that's projections or something else. So put an S by posterior white column. The entire information carried by the posterior white column is sensory. Okay? Put an S by the dorsal root. All of the nerve fibers in the dorsal root are sensory. Put an S by posterior gray horn. All the cell bodies in the posterior gray horn are sensory neuron cell bodies. And put an S by dorsal root ganglion. Okay? So I'll name that list again. Dorsal root ganglion is all sensory. Dorsal root is all sensory. Posterior gray horn is all sensory. And dorsal or posterior white columns are all sensory. Okay?
Are all joint sense? Or
No, just sensory. They're all sensory. That's all we're worried about right now. Okay? So that's the sensory component. Now let's look at motor. When I make a voluntary decision to move a bone or move my lips, I make a conscious decision in the frontal lobe of my brain. There is a fold of neuronal gray matter, cell bodies, that send axons down the brain. It will cross over in the brainstem and descend down the spinal cord to whatever level those muscles are located. So if I'm moving my upper limb, it's going to come to here. If I'm moving my respiratory muscles to here, my lower limbs to here. Okay? One neuron. It's going to start in the frontal lobe of the brain and come down the spinal cord. Then in the spinal cord, it's going to synapse with another neuron, another motor neuron that leaves and goes out in our spinal nerves and actually gets to the muscle. All right? So I want to draw those upper neurons are coming down in the lateral white column. Because remember, our posterior was all sensory. So here's a neuron coming down from the brain in the lateral white column. And then it's going to go into my anterior gray horn. It's going to go into my anterior gray horn, and there it's going to synapse with the cell bodies in the anterior gray horn. All right, so here is a descending track of neurons whose cell bodies are located in my brain. And we see it on the opposite side as well. And we even see it in the middle, the anterior. But these are going to cross over. All right, so those are all white matter in the lateral white column, in the anterior white column. And then they are going to synapse with cell bodies that form the anterior gray horn. What would be the appearance of these neurons? Multipolar, pseudo-unipolar, bipolar? Motor neurons are multipolar. So those multipolar neurons that we drew, this is where they're found. It's in the anterior gray horn. So their axons are going to go out the ventral root. Detecting a pattern here. What's the function of ventral structures? Motor. Anterior gray horn is all motor. You can put an M by anterior gray horn. Those are all voluntary motor neurons. You ever heard of polio? The polio virus, some people think it's gone and they don't need to take the vaccine anymore, but it's starting to poke up again. The virus that attacks and kills the cell bodies of anterior gray horn cells is what causes polio. And so there's no ability to get an electrical current to the muscle cells when those cell bodies are gone. So anterior gray horn is motor. Ventral root is motor. Anterior structures. Okay, anterior gray horn is motor. Ventral root is motor. Would this collection of cell bodies be a nucleus or a ganglion here? Not a ganglion. A nucleus, because it's in the central nervous system. Okay. Now we have one other area of motor neurons. These are involuntary motor neurons in the lateral gray horn. And they're going to go out the ventral root as well. So the lateral gray horn is motor. These are going to go to heart muscle, smooth muscle, stomach muscle. All right? So, ventral ramus, sensory or motor?
Motor.
Look at the picture. Both. So put a B, a letter B as in both, for ventral ramus. When I cut the ventral ramus of the spinal cord, right here, I am going to lose both sensory and motor function. If I cut only dorsal, I'm going to lose only sensory. If I cut only ventral roots, I'm going to lose only motor. But once I pass the spinal nerve, I'm going to lose both. All right? Now this is looking more and more complicated, but remember we're just looking at general concepts here. One structure I haven't talked about, the dorsal branch of the spinal cord. So in this diagram, look how small that dorsal branch is. So here's the spinal nerve, here's the ventral ramus, here's the dorsal ramus. We're not going to pay much attention to this until we get to the muscle system. But if I put my hands around my waist, this distance from here to here, starting from here all the way up to here, about 4 inches on either side of my spinal column, is carried sensory information in the dorsal rami. Okay? And the deep muscles of my back under there that keep my spinal column upright or turn it are innervated by the motor neurons. So it's a smaller branch, but it also has sensory neurons, and it also has motor neurons. So I'm going to go through the separation one more time. Okay, sensory only. Dorsal root ganglion, sensory only. Dorsal root, sensory only. Posterior gray horn, sensory only. Posterior white column, I know it has red here, but that red is supposed to be coming straight out this way. So posterior white column, sensory only. Okay. Everybody with me on that one? All right. Lateral gray horn, motor only. Anterior gray horn, motor only. Ventral root, motor only. Okay. Now the structures that have both sensory and motor. Lateral white column has ascending tracts and descending tracts. It is both motor and sensory. Anterior white column is actually, I've only drawn motor here, but that is also both motor and sensory. I've only drawn the motor one, but it's both motor and sensory. Spinal nerve is both motor and sensory. Ventral ramus and dorsal ramus of the spinal nerve are both motor and sensory.
The spinal nerve is?
Yeah, the spinal nerve is just this part right here, and then it has the divisions of dorsal and ventral rami. So the spinal nerve is both motor and sensory. Okay? Yes?
Was dorsal ramus both?
Yes. Dorsal root is only sensory, but dorsal ramus is both. All right? So again, this has the really fuzzy parts to it. After lecture on Friday, this will be really clear, okay? Because we will have gone through these pathways and talked about what's happening. Yes?
The commissures?
The commissures, don't worry about. They have both sensory and motor and also integrative neurons, so we just won't give them a sign of function. Okay, so let's